Welcome to the Mystery School channel. This is your brother disciple, Vito Corleone, and today we have the third and final video in the series on the critique of moral objectivism. In the first part of the series, we introduced the arguments of moral objectivism versus moral subjectivism, sometimes called moral realism versus moral anti-realism, and then we introduced the first proposition that explains how moral value is objective because of external laws of nature dictating human values, as well as internal laws of nature in our psyche that give us innate a priori knowledge of these external laws of nature. In the second part of the series, we discussed the second and third propositions. The second proposition explains how all cultures throughout history have recognized these objective laws of morality, and in the third proposition, we discussed exactly what those laws of objective morality are that we need to pursue in our personal development. In the third and final video in the series, we will do a critique of moral subjectivism. We will respond to counter-arguments against moral objectivism, and then we will discuss the flaws in the moral subjectivist arguments. Lewis responds to many counter-arguments throughout his books. The first one he addresses is the counter-argument from those people who claim that it's a herd instinct. He explains that we can compare our instincts, such as our sexual instinct, to what we feel in terms of our conscience, and it's not the same thing. If the moral laws that we are speaking of herein can be reduced to a mere instinct, then we would be able to identify just one instinct that is continuously telling us to do the same thing, just like the sex instinct is always telling us to follow our sex drive. But as Lewis points out, the conscience is not always telling us to follow one instinct. In different situations, our conscience tells us to follow different instincts, such as a love for one's children. Sometimes the conscience tells us to even ignore our instinctual reaction to run away because we should help someone out. Therefore, our conscience is definitively not a herd instinct. Also, calling it a herd instinct proves the argument that morality is objectively innate in humans. Every viewer understands that whether or not this argument is accepted depends on if this argument provides demonstrative evidence that morality is an intrinsic aspect of the human being, and that the argument accurately describes the conscience. So, do you admit to having a conscience? Would you admit that there is an aspect of your being that makes you feel bad when you've done something wrong, even when you don't think you've done something wrong? Is there an aspect of your being that still makes you feel like you've done something wrong? Well, I have a conscience, even if there are dissenters to this argument. The dissenter cannot deny that I have a conscience. Consequently, from the standpoint of phenomenology, it would be hypocritical of a person to say that emotions are not on the same level as perception if we believe in an objective reality that can be known. Our conscience is objectively on the same level of being as any other rational idea about reality. The biggest flaw in the moral subjectivist arguments is that all moral anti-realists hold moral value to be objective. Anyone who has ever expressed moral outrage, even once, recognizes that moral value is objective. A person cannot express moral outrage and also be a moral subjectivist because it would be no different than expressing outrage at another person's favorite color. The first question that must be asked is, what standard of morality should this other person or these people be conforming to if there are no common standards to compare anyone's actions to, as we discussed in proposition number 1? For anyone to be morally outraged, they must accept that other people should not only act in a way to conform to a specific standard, but also that these people should know about this specific standard in which they should be following. This moral outrage also includes directing it towards the universe itself, as so many people do when they say the universe is unfair. How can anyone claim that the universe should be morally good unless there is some standard to which they are comparing the universe to, and it's not living up to that standard? For we must ask these people, where did you get that standard to measure that the universe itself is unfair? Accordingly, anyone who has expressed moral outrage in any way, even at the universe, is in reality holding moral value to be objective in those moments, regardless of whether they know it or not. However, even through all of this, some people will still claim that moral value is just some kind of subjective preference. You have your truth and I have my truth, is the common assertion. The most interesting thing is that although the dissenters will deny that value is objective in a philosophical conversation or argument, they are simultaneously trying to claim that their denial of objective value has objective value. The dissenter claims that there is no objective moral truth besides recognizing there is no objective moral truth. And bam! Socrates just made the dissenter admit to maintaining an objective moral value system. What never claimed objectivity cannot be countered by subjectivity, and if the moral subjectivists claim objectivity, then the subjectivists just admitted that we are all objectively experiencing the world through the conscience, same as the Kantian categories of space and time. But in this argument, we experience the universe through space-time and our conscience, or being, time, and conscience for fundamental ontology. The fact that people constantly talk about how they think the universe is unfair is proof that humans cannot experience the universe except through their conscience, as this is the reason we expect a fair universe. All the moral subjectivists, such as the positivists, pragmatists, nihilists, etc., implicitly base their arguments on the idea that all humans have morality, but morality is simply either a subjective preference or a superimposition of the emotions onto reality. If everyone intrinsically has these aspects a part of their being, then that admits the argument that humans objectively cannot experience the universe unless it's through using our conscience. And, as explained in proposition number 3, people reach different moral conclusions because they are at various stages of moral development. Consequently, I draw the following conclusions. These things which I have called for convenience the Tao, and which others may call natural law, or traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected. If value is retained, these laws are retained. The effort to refute it and raise a new system of value in its place is self-contradictory. Moral subjectivists do not live up to their claim that value can be invented. Claiming that value can be invented is like claiming to invent a new color. Claiming to invent a new form of the good is contradictory because the argument doesn't invent anything and simply returns to the objectively common ideas of what the good already was. Moral value cannot be anything other than it is. An army cannot be praised for being cowardly, and a society cannot be built on the endorsement of rape. This is objectively obvious to all who are willing to develop their conscience. An army must be praised for being courageous, and everyone must disapprove of rape. These values are as objective as any other objective aspect of reality that math and science work with. It must be made explicitly clear that we are talking about human relationships. It is objectively true that human relationships cannot be built on rape, murder, or fraud. Murder is the perfect example of how obvious this is because there is no relationship if one person murders the other one. Accordingly, the biggest flaw in moral subjectivism is that even moral subjectivists recognize the Tao, or the objective aspects of being human, Heidegger's Dasein. Both the term Tao and Dasein were used throughout this essay to represent the objectively common ground experienced by all humans. When push comes to shove, the moral subjectivists don't invent their own system of values like they claim, nor do they act like it's a subjective preference that could be replaced by another preference or emotional reaction. When push comes to shove, the moral subjectivists omit the moral objectivist argument at every turn. The moral subjectivist desires their armies to be courageous, as well as the moral subjectivist argument that morality and ethics are a social convention builds themselves off the objective common ground that human relationships require certain ethics to function and won't function if not upheld. The moral subjectivists admit this when they are in the jury box, at a job interview, when expressing moral outrage, while creating advertisement to the human pathos, the ethos, pathos, and logos, and when choosing which campaign to vote for. As well as, fundamentally and most importantly, when someone wants to get a mate or a sexual partner. Moral anti-realists do not practice what they preach with their actions. They contradict their words with their actions. With their words, they're saying that they can invent value and invent all of these other different aspects of morality, but in reality, their actions follow these 9 laws on screen in a confused way as soon as it comes down to the human relationships that they have that I mentioned previously, like getting a job. So due to the fact the moral anti-realist does not accurately describe reality, then we must necessarily reject their claim of knowledge, because fundamentally a claim of knowledge must describe reality. People make philosophical careers by arguing for moral subjectivism, moral anti-realism, but most of these people who argue for it don't actually live it. When you point out to the dissenter that it's tough to live a consistent and coherent moral subjective life because anyone who does just ends up doing all of the crimes that we've talked about in this essay, the moral subjectivist doesn't change their life, but continues to argue for a life that they don't live. The most successful moral subjectivists are the criminals in every society. All those people who participate in the deprivation of good from the rest of us. And that really should be explicitly clear that this statement is a fact. The most successful moral subjectivists are the criminals in every society. Those people who argue for moral anti-realism, like those quoted on screen, abolish their own humanity by asserting that morality could be anything other than objective. We all know a priori that moral value is not like having a favorite color, as if rape is just a preference, pedophilia is just a preference, and torture is just a preference. This is a consequence of the moral anti-realists trying to live a life that asserts something other than objectively valuable things like healthy relationships, rational societies, and common standards of ethics based on innate principles. Also, a moral anti-realist cannot tell other people how to act by definition of their own argument. Continuing with the example of the favorite color, it would be no different than telling other people what kind of favorite color to have. Accordingly, moral anti-realists condone criminal behavior towards themselves by saying that it is anything other than objectively wrong, and consequently, they negate their own humanity. The whole book, The Abolition of Man, is to explain how if someone denies objective moral value, they abolish the possibility of a true good and beautiful human experience, because people cannot pursue a true good and beautiful life if they live in a world overrun by criminal behavior. And of course, criminal behavior is defined as the deprivation of good. Pictured on screen is the perfect example of the moral anti-realist hypocrisy, because as soon as the moral anti-realist wants to pursue a healthy relationship, they immediately go back to the fact that they need to uphold these laws of nature. For example, if you have a band of thieves, and this band of thieves goes out and raids towns and comes back to their base, and they're hanging out with their squad, if anyone in their squad steals from that band of thieves, they're being out of that squad. They're going to be ostracized minimum, murdered maximum penalty for those actions, because human relationships require objective laws of nature to be followed, or else they cannot be upheld. And so it is truly a perfect example of the hypocrisy of the moral anti-realists to quote how they talk about stealing things fair and square, as if someone could possibly ever steal something fair and square. An individual cannot claim that morality is subjective and then try to impose their morality onto other people, because the very act of doing that presupposes the validity of some ethics, but not other ethics in healthy human relationships. It is presupposing that certain ethics are superior or more justifiable than other ethics. The anti-realist argument presupposes some kind of standard to weigh the ethical ideologies, which proves that the moral anti-realist believes in some kind of standard to judge whether ethics are justifiable. As soon as it is established that the moral anti-realist arguments always follow this path to a more justified subjective ethics, then that is the evidence necessary to establish moral objectivism. In proposition number 1 in this video series, we discussed how there are common moral standards that all humans share. Accordingly, once the viewer knows the common standards explained in the first video in the series on moral objectivism, then the viewer will recognize that this standard is the same one that all moral anti-realist philosophers use to discern which ethics are more justifiable than others, so they fundamentally admit the moral objectivist argument. Certain things are objectively wrong, and even most moral anti-realists will admit this once they are subjected to crimes and inevitably express moral outrage. So the fundamental conclusion is that moral anti-realists are irrational because their arguments assert a contradiction, as they do not live the life that they are preaching. If we followed each supposed moral anti-realist around with a camera, we would eventually find them naturally expressing moral outrage about something eventually. And if that same person does not express outrage at a person's favorite color, then we can understand that that person necessarily understands the difference. And they are simply not admitting the inconsistency and incoherency in the logic. Therefore, due to reductio ad absurdum, we cannot choose moral anti-realism because of all of the aforementioned arguments that we discussed in this video on the critique of moral anti-realism. Since there are only two options and we rejected one of them through a process of elimination, we are left with the other option as the only philosophically tenable worldview. In conclusion, the reason that this is the only legitimate argument for moral objectivism is that any argument that claims to be morally objective must prove all of the following essential elements and major points that were mentioned throughout this essay. The argument must prove that there is an objective aspect to the claims made. The argument must do so without relying upon God, just like Lewis and I have not mentioned God throughout this entire video series. The argument must prove that the objective aspect of reality has already existed because objectivity doesn't change. Anything objectively true for us must be true for the people in the past and in the future. The argument must also provide the method of cognition for these objective claims of knowledge to be made. Also, the argument must prove the moral value cannot be anything other than it is. Finally, the argument must demonstrate that humans are born in an infantile state of confusion with a mix of innate a priori knowledge and societal conditioning. And due to the societal conditioning confusing people out of using their innate a priori knowledge, we have people who disagree on morality due to the fact that they are on different stages of development. This last point is absolutely essential to understand because the moral anti-realist immediately jumps to the conclusion that because they meet people who have different perspectives on morality, that the only necessary conclusion is that people have no common moral values. But in actuality, that's not really the case, as I've demonstrated throughout this video series, is that people do have the same moral values, and that simply people are confused because of things like society telling them to doubt and to be a skeptic of all of these aspects. And so, of course, someone who is born into this state is going to be confused if they should act upon their innate a priori knowledge, or if they should do what society is telling them to do and doubt and be a skeptic to their innate knowledge about reality. And so I thought it needed to be re-emphasized that the moral anti-realist argument doesn't necessarily follow from its premises, due to the fact that the proposition 3 in this moral objectivist argument is also an equally tenable and logical conclusion from the premise that we meet people who have different perspectives on morality. And so, due to the fact that these are equally available conclusions from this premise, we must look at other evidence to verify these claims of knowledge. And that evidence is what I have included in this video series, so that everyone can understand that from the evidence available, the conclusion that needs to be drawn is that people are born in an infantile state of confusion, as opposed to the conclusion that, oh, because people have disagreements on morality, therefore morality doesn't exist. That is not the necessary conclusion, and I have demonstrated that with this argument. Any argument that claims moral objectivity must prove all of these things, and if it does not, then it cannot be a tenable worldview for moral objectivism. Accordingly, as with all worldviews, Lewis makes it clear that this argument doesn't get rid of subjectivity, because there's no way to understand the truth without understanding it from your own perspective. Even if it's an objective truth, people can only understand it from their level of development, just like math and science. Therefore, I, the philosopher, Vito Corleone, announced to the world that a scientific consensus has been reached regarding the agreement of all people and all cultures as to the nature of the laws of objective morality, because as we saw in this video today, even the moral anti-realist admits the moral objectivist argument at every turn. Consequently, these laws of objective moral value are something that we must live. Philosophy is to search for the truth so that we can change the way we live to reflect the reality that we have come upon. Consequently, I used to be a moral subjectivist, and now, because of this newfound truth, I have changed my life, and I hope you are also willing to be a moral objectivist from now on as well. In actuality, people need to realize that they've been moral objectivists this whole time, and anyone who identifies as a moral anti-realist is in actuality just morally confused. Finally, Lewis also makes it clear that he is not interested in preaching. He is neither perfect nor am I. Even when we know these laws, we still make mistakes, as I've expressed previously. Lewis and I are simply trying to inform everyone of these laws of nature. Hopefully, throughout the video series, you realize that you are already participating and following these moral laws, and so are most people. I honestly don't think it's asking too much to follow these laws, especially since most people are already doing it because they are laws. This won't necessarily have a big change, but we should at least clear up the confusion for all those people who desire to know the truth. A couple of words in closing. The first thing I wanted to mention is that not everything that I said comes directly from C.S. Lewis and his books. For example, what I included regarding the Kantian categories and fundamental ontology and Dasein from Heidegger, that does not exist in any of C.S. Lewis's works, and I just wanted to point that out to make sure that everyone understood that I wasn't necessarily trying to represent the information as being a part of his argument, but simply that the information that was expressed in his argument was also expressed in the arguments of other philosophers throughout history. And so, in that regard, I will be writing another draft of this essay in the future once I have enough feedback to make another draft. And so if you have any feedback, please let me know in the comments. Any counter arguments, I would love to hear them. Questions, so that I can elaborate on certain points, or any kind of suggestions that you may have in regards to making the argument better. Please let me know, because I would really like to work on creating a true, good, and beautiful culture, and then a true, good, and beautiful world. And that's really my goal as a philosopher. And so in that regard, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And we will see you next time on the Mystery School channel. Please make sure to subscribe and share. Have a good one, and we'll see you next time.